everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Kate Vitasek, Forbes senior contributor and distinguished fellow at the Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Tennessee. Kate, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. It's exciting to share our expertise at the University of Tennessee with Forbes and the attendees.
Of course, and your expertise is needed in this situation. Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed earlier this week after a cargo ship hit it. Obviously, first and foremost, this is a tragic event. Construction workers lost their lives because they were working on the bridge when it collapsed. But there are also economic impacts from the collapse. The American Trucking Association reportedly said around 4,900 trucks per day use the bridge, and $28 billion worth of goods are transported across the bridge a year. So what effect is this going to have on the supply chain?
Well, it is going to have an effect. There will probably be, most importantly, increased cost. I mean, you've got to reroute those trucks around that bridge. So every mile is a cost that we have to do. There's a delay in timing, but for the cargo as well. So it's not just around the transportation of the trucks that go over the bridge, which, by the way, that was the main thoroughfare for hazmat because they weren't allowed to use the tunnel. So you'll have some additional cost. To get around, I don't live there, but I think it's about 15 miles from when I was doing some research. So it's not catastrophic to go around, but it's time, and you've got to combat all those commuters who are also having to go around.
The economy, as we know, is one of those top issues facing Americans. Will they feel the economic impacts of this immediately? Is that delayed? What does that look like when there is a disruption in the supply chain?
Well, I want to tackle that from two areas, because there's someone like yourself or myself who has goods that you're buying. But I think equally important that we forget about is all the jobs that people are affiliated with the port. So I want to start with the jobs first, because the state of Maryland reported there's about 15,000 people that work directly in port-related jobs, and then many, many more that don't. Those folks, I mean, those ships can't get in. Those longshoremen aren't going to get a paycheck. Maybe their union has some kind of aspect around that they can deal with. But there is definitely going to be a shortage of people who that is their livelihood. And so I think we forget about that in the supply chain. But from a goods perspective, I'm not really that worried about the impact of us not getting our thing that we want, because when you look at what the Port of Baltimore did, it was mostly automotive. It was really known for being a roll-on, roll-off port where cars or farm equipment could roll on and roll off. And they had about 750,000 cars that would be imported and farm equipment being exported. That's less than about 5% of all the cars that are sold in America. So put that in perspective. 15.5 million cars are sold. Only 750,000 went through the port. So yes, it will have an impact. Is it going to be catastrophic? Probably not.
That's good news for consumers. Inflation, as you know, has been a concern over the past few years. It has been high, has been cooling off in the past few months. Do you expect inflation to be nudged back up because of this event?
I don't know about inflation per se, but the cost associated with this, for those organizations who ship through the port or that now have to send their trucks around the extra 15 miles, that is added cost. So yeah, in a roundabout way, that's inflation, but you won't have that same extra cost at other areas. The Port of LA isn't going to have these increased costs. So it'll be interesting to see how companies deal with that. Will it just be, will they take and peanut butter spread that out and make it inflation because they have to absorb it? Probably so. But I wouldn't directly relate it to inflation per se. It is a cost hit that they have to absorb. And they may choose to send that over and pass it along to the consumers. Now, do keep in mind, Brittany, what goes through that port? It's not a lot of goods. Right? The Port of Baltimore only has about 1.1 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent containers. That's small in the grand scheme of things. Just to the north, New York, New Jersey, 4 million, LA, 9 million. So the total amount of containers that came in and went through ports last year was about 47 million. This is only 1.1 million. So you're not seeing that huge of an impact. Yes, there's an impact, but the other ports are going to be able to absorb this, but it will increase some costs associated with those reroutings.
When you see a supply chain disruption, that is, you're looking at the bright side here. It's not as bad as it would be if it were other ports, but how long does this last? How long will this disrupt the supply chain?
That is a great question. And I think that has to really depend on how long they can clear the debris. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not there on site, so I don't know about that. I can tell you when the Minneapolis bridge collapsed in 2007, we have done extensive research on this. I actually wrote a lot about the Minneapolis bridge. They were able to go from the collapse to having a bridge fully functioning, up and running in 13 months. So it is possible to move fast when people collaborate, when we get past the bureaucracies and hierarchy, but I don't know the exact situation of how long it's going to clear the debris. So clearing the debris is going to help open up that port again. That's going to be a game changer, right? But now I have to rebuild the bridge. So rebuilding the bridge, the best case, like Minneapolis, 13 months. Worst case, gosh, they just did a bridge not too far away that connected Maryland, and I forget which one it was, the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. 13 years. And so the average time it takes to rebuild a bridge is about between 3 and 7 years. So
that's a big discrepancy.
Time.
That's a big discrepancy there. 13 months and 13 years. The average time, 5 to 7, is what you're saying, 5 to 7 years. So who should be involved in the rebuild? Because I'm sure it looked a lot different for the 13-month build opposed to the 13-year build.
Well, I am so glad you asked that, because this is actually one of the things that I personally study, is how can we make get our supply chains to move so fast to do these rebuilds? And the laws of our country enable that. And I think one thing that Biden is doing that's going to be helpful is he's already said money's off the table, we're going to pay for it. But then you have the bureaucracy of the procurement process. Now, in the state of Minnesota, they were able to declare it a disaster. That allowed them to move a bit faster. But it was actually the process that they used through their bid process that was a game changer. So they used a best value technique. They also used a design build process. So when you actually looked and researched their bid, they went to industry. They went to the construction companies and said, hey, I've got a problem. What's the quickest, fastest, cheapest way I can rebuild this bridge? And amazing how innovative the construction companies were. The traditional approach, gosh, I have to have a plan and I have to draw up a thing, and right. And so our process that we typically use is very protracted and very hierarchical. It does not have to be. And so my challenge would be, I hope that the state of Maryland looks at what is the art of the possible and what Minnesota did, because 13 months under budget, Brittany, under budget, and it won almost a dozen awards. That's the art of the possible. And so let's not get wrapped up into hierarchy and bureaucracy. We know how to rebuild these bridges safely, quickly, and affordable.
And award-winning, might I add. But is there any indication of which route Baltimore is going to go? I know this tragedy just happened, but does it look like they're going to go the more traditional route or the Minnesota route?
Good question. Typically, you see governments being more progressive in their procurement policy when there is an emergency. And so I'm going to guess they're going to go more towards the Minnesota Department of Transportation route. But will they use all their tools in their toolkit? the laws enable us to do what Minnesota Department of Transportation did. It wasn't a secret. It's just not the norm. The norm is I'm going to tell you how to build this bridge instead of going to the contractors and having them say, gosh, here's my problem. What's the most innovative, best way to do this? It really flips it on its head, and we're just not used to being progressive that way in government sometimes.
This has been a national conversation since it happened on Tuesday morning, and I am interested, do you think anything is missing from that broader dialogue coming in as a supply chain expert?
I really like the fact that the Biden administration has created an executive order last year to create this task force. And that is something that was newly developed, and they already met yesterday, although I looked up the results of their discussion, and it kind of doesn't say much. I was hoping it would have some really good stuff in there, but it was kind of fluffy. I was like, well, they're working. But the fact that you've got these different agencies that are formally part of a task force, and that the bridge could collapse, and within just a couple days, they're already meeting. That's a great sign of collaboration. It gives me hope, because in the past, what you'd see is these functional silos, and it becomes hard for us to address supply chain issues. So I love this fact that we have a task force. I'm not part of the task force. I don't know how well it's operating, but the spirit of it is really good. The spirit of the fact that the federal government's already said, I'm going to fund the bridge. The signals are going in the right direction. So I'm hopeful.
That's good that you're seeing collaboration in the days after this. But what are you looking out for next then? What's on your radar?
Well, what would be on my radar is I'd love to see the bid process that Maryland issues, because that bid process will give a lot of indication about how much time it's going to take, and if they're being a bit more progressive or they're being a bit more traditional.
Kate Vitasek, thank you so much for lending your expertise today. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks for having me.